Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world that feels like it belongs in the pages of some grim fairy tale, but sadly it was all too real. The medieval centuries in Europe were ruled not just by kings and castles, but by laws so severe that even breathing wrong could make you wonder if you were next in line for punishment. Imagine living in a time when you couldn't simply decide what to wear, what to say, or even what you ate without first worrying about the possibility of a noose, a fine, or a good old-fashioned public humiliation. It's the kind of era where your morning coffee would probably come with a side order of paranoia, if coffee had even been around. Trust me, you wouldn't last a week in that world. Honestly, you probably wouldn't last a day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these sleepy journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward through a dimly lit village, where the wooden houses creak in the cold wind, and the cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with rain. Above the rooftops, a bell tolls from the manor tower, and though it only signals the passing of an hour, your heart tightens. In this world, even the sound of a bell could carry legal consequences. It meant curfew, and being caught outside after it rang wasn't just a small fine. No, in medieval Europe, the laws of feudal lords stretched like invisible chains across every moment of daily life. Here, a peasant owes more than just sweat and labor. Every chicken, every turnip, every loaf of bread you bake belongs at least in part to someone above you. The feudal system wasn't written in neat books for villagers to read. No, it was lived out, enforced by men in chainmail and whispered about in the smoky corners of taverns. You feel the weight of that system pressing against your chest now, heavier than the damp air. And what's wild is this: historians still debate whether the people at the very bottom even understood the full scope of the laws they lived under, or if they simply obeyed out of sheer fear. After all, how do you argue with a knight who carries a sword longer than your arm and insists you've broken some obscure code of loyalty? That wasn't a courtroom, it was survival theater. The village you're walking through tonight might seem sleepy, but behind each shuttered window lies a family, calculating how much of their crop they can eat without angering the Lord, how many words they can say before they step into treason, how many children they can raise before the taxes break them. These were the opening chords of a symphony of harsh laws that would only grow louder, stranger, and crueler as the centuries rolled on. You glance up at the manor house looming above, its torches flickering like watchful eyes. You can almost hear a whisper carried on the wind. Remember who owns you, and so you walk on, aware now that in this world law isn't justice, it's power, sharpened like a blade. And the deeper you go into these rules, the more you'll see how survival itself was an art, one misstep away from ruin. The road beneath your feet narrows, curling like a serpent toward the looming manor. You pause at the sight of peasants lining up, heads bowed, each clutching a bundle of grain or a few coins. This isn't charity, it's law. The feudal lord claims what he calls his rights, and those rights extend to nearly every corner of your life. Imagine paying rent not just for your hut, but for the very right to grind your wheat, to cross a bridge, or even to marry. That's the kind of nickel and diming that would make your local cable company look generous. In medieval Europe, the law of the land was really the law of the Lord. Forget a neat list of rules written in accessible language. Most of the time these laws were traditions, edicts, or even whims. You never knew when a new decree might roll down from the manor like a thundercloud. One week, you're allowed to collect firewood from the forest. The next week, it's suddenly a punishable offense. You could argue, sure, but you'd likely end up fined, whipped, or worse. What's stranger is that some lords took their authority so far they demanded rights over weddings in their domain. There's an old claim, mostly myth but persistent in whispers, that certain nobles believed they had the first right to a bride on her wedding night. Historians still argue fiercely about whether this ever truly happened, or whether it was a smear campaign invented centuries later. Still, the fact that the rumor felt believable tells you just how suffocating that authority was. You watch as a man steps forward, clutching his meager sack of barley. The steward sneers, measuring it with a wooden stick. Too light, and the man may find himself owing double next season, or worse, labeled as a thief stealing from the Lord's due. And when someone's called a thief in these times, They're lucky if the punishment is only losing a hand. It wasn't just crops or coins either. If you brewed beer, you might have to pay a special fee just for the right to sell it in the village. If you wanted to grind flour, you could only use the Lord's mill, and of course he took a cut. Imagine being forced to use one overpriced service provider for everything in your life. Oh wait, that's starting to sound familiar, isn't it? You continue walking, your cloak pulled tighter as a drizzle begins to fall. Overhead, the manor windows glow warm and golden, while the villagers shiver in the cold. The imbalance is staggering, and yet it's baked into the very fabric of the law. The rules aren't written to protect you, they're written to remind you that you are owned. And somewhere deep inside, you realize the cruelest part isn't the punishment itself, but the constant fear of breaking a rule you didn't even know existed. That fear kept peasants obedient far more effectively than swords ever could. The drizzle thickens as you follow the sound of voices toward the village square. A wooden post stands in the center, scarred with deep gouges and dark stains. At first glance, it could be just another weather-beaten beam, but then you notice the iron shackles bolted to its sides, swinging lightly in the damp wind. This is no ordinary post, it's where justice is displayed. Well, justice by medieval standards, which is to say a combination of fear, spectacle, and questionable logic. Here, the laws that govern daily life weren't about fairness, but about control. Steal an apple, and you might find yourself tied here for hours, mocked, spat upon, or even whipped until your back looked like a poorly ploughed field. What's striking, though, is how petty the crimes could be. Sometimes the punishment wasn't about theft or violence. At all, it was for breaking social codes that today would barely raise an eyebrow. You overhear a villager muttering about a woman, punished for baking bread on the wrong day of the week. Another for wearing clothes finer than her station allowed. It seems laughable, but the consequences were anything but funny. Public humiliation was the medieval equivalent of trending on Twitter for all the wrong reasons. Except you couldn't delete your account and walk away. The laws themselves were often a patchwork of local custom and lordly decree. There wasn't one clear legal code for everyone to follow. One village might fine you for letting your pig wander into the street. The next village over might execute you for it. Historians still debate how much of this variation was intentional, a way for lords to keep people disoriented and afraid. After all, when you never know exactly what's illegal, you end up playing it safe, living smaller, quieter, less free. You watch as a young boy, no more than 12, is dragged forward by two burly men. His crime? Tossing stones at a neighbor's goat. The crowd jeers, but some faces look uneasy. Still, no one dares to intervene. The boy is tied to the post, his head hung low as the steward reads out his offense like a priest intoning a sacred rite. A few lashes later, and he is released, stumbling into the arms of his mother. The law is satisfied, but the scar remains, both on his back and in his mind. Oddly enough, animals themselves could be punished under these harsh codes. Pigs, dogs, even insects were once hauled into court, accused of crimes like damaging crops or injuring people. A pig might be dressed in human clothes, paraded before a judge, and then executed. Absurd, yes, but it reinforced a chilling idea. In this world, nothing was beyond the reach of law, and everything could be made an example. As the rain patters against your hood, you can't help but chuckle at the thought of a rooster being tried for waking up the Lord too early. It sounds ridiculous, almost like a Monty Python sketch. But here, in the shadows of medieval law, ridiculous often walked hand in hand with terrifying. You move on from the square, your footsteps echoing on the wet stones, carrying with you the uneasy knowledge that in this place, even laughter could be dangerous if heard at the wrong time. The path bends away from the square, leading you toward a row of low cottages pressed together like weary old men huddled against the rain. Through the half-open shutters, you glimpse families sitting by smoky fires, clutching whatever scraps of bread or turnip stew they've managed to hold onto after the Lord's collectors have taken their share. Poverty here isn't just misfortune, it's often a legal sentence in itself. In medieval Europe, debt was a crime, not just a burden. Owe a few coins and you might find yourself stripped of your tools, your oxen, or even the very roof over your head. And if you couldn't pay, into the debtor's prison you went, where the punishment wasn't only the cold stone walls, but the knowledge that your family outside would continue to suffer. Sometimes wives and children were forced to pay off what you owed through labor, effectively turning your entire household into hostages of the law. You lean against the damp wall of a cottage, listening to whispers of a man from this very village who lost everything after borrowing a few shillings for seed grain. When the harvest failed, he couldn't repay. First his cart was seized, then his tools. Finally he himself was shackled and hauled away, leaving his wife begging at the manor gates. Some stories say he died in prison. Others claim he returned years later, broken and silent, a ghost in the shape of a man. Historians still debate whether these debt laws were designed to recover money or to remind everyone else what happens when you dare to fall behind. The cruelty lay not only in the punishment, but in its endlessness. Unlike a thief who might lose a hand and be done with it, debtors were trapped in a spiral. You could be released only if someone paid your debts for you, a rare mercy. Otherwise, the law ensured you paid with your freedom, your health, or your life. Imagine being charged overdraft fees today, but instead of a slap on the wrist, you're sentenced to spend the next decade in chains. Talk about harsh late fees. What's stranger still is that even after death, debts didn't always vanish. Families could inherit them, creating generations bound not by blood but by legal obligation. Entire lineages dragged behind them the weight of a few unlucky coins. It makes you realize that in this world, poverty itself was criminalized. Being poor wasn't an accident. It was a violation of order. The drizzle has turned into a steady rain now, soaking your cloak as you pass a group of villagers, huddled beneath a sagging awning. They glance at you with weary eyes, as if measuring whether you are another mouth to feed or another competitor for what little is left. And in their silence, you can almost hear the chains of invisible debt clinking. Binding them as tightly as any iron, you walk on shivering, carrying the bitter awareness that in these laws, survival wasn't about justice or fairness. It was about staying one step ahead of ruin, knowing that if you slipped, the law would not just punish you, it would own you. The rain eases, leaving the village air heavy with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Your feet carry you toward a small bakery, its thatched roof sagging under years of neglect. A faint warmth leaks through the cracks, along with the unmistakable aroma of fresh bread. For a moment your stomach growls and you feel a flicker of comfort, until you notice the boy standing outside, gaunt and desperate, staring through the doorway as if his eyes alone could eat. Hunger was one of the cruelest companions of medieval life, and stealing food, even something as small as a loaf of bread, could change your fate forever. Laws were ruthless when it came to theft. A child who pocketed a crust might face the stocks, a whipping, or even worse, mutilation like the loss of a hand. You think of today's world, where a stern lecture at a supermarket might be the worst outcome. Back then, 5-finger discount meant literally losing those fingers. Inside the bakery, the miller's wife counts out coins, watching each one with hawk-like suspicion. Flour was precious, guarded almost as fiercely as gold. And bread wasn't just food, it was survival itself. One theft threatened not only a merchant's profits, but the fragile order of the village. Harsh punishment wasn't just revenge. It was theater, designed to remind everyone else, don't you dare. You picture a case told in whispers, a starving man caught stealing bread in a neighboring town. Instead of mercy, he was branded with a hot iron on his cheek, marked for life, so that every face he met would know his shame. Historians still argue whether such branding was more about deterring theft or about permanently labeling the poor as criminals. Either way, the result was the same. One act of hunger condemned a man to carry his crime like a tattoo across his skin, and sometimes the law seemed almost gleefully cruel. There are records of people hanged for stealing food during famines, as if the crime wasn't the theft itself, but the audacity to survive. Imagine punishing someone for trying not to starve. It's like grounding a child for breathing too loudly. Absurd, but painfully real. You step closer to the boy outside the bakery. His hands twitch as if he's about to snatch something, but he doesn't. Maybe he knows the price, or maybe his fear is stronger than his hunger. Either way, the law has already won without lifting a finger. As you walk away, the warmth of the bakery fades behind you, replaced by the cold certainty that in this world, mercy was often illegal, and hunger was a crime punishable by law. The road grows quieter as you move away from the square. The air feels heavy, almost suspicious, as if every word you speak might be carried by the damp wind into the wrong ears. And in this world, words themselves could destroy you. In medieval Europe, the law didn't just punish actions. It punished voices. Say something careless about your Lord and you might be accused of slander. Whisper doubts about the king or church, and you could be branded a traitor or a heretic. Even casual insults between neighbors were dangerous, because in some towns, the spoken word carried the weight of a binding contract. If you promised something out loud, the law might hold you to it whether you meant it or not. Imagine blurting out, "Sure, I'll give you half my sandwich," and suddenly finding yourself in court when you change your mind. Not exactly playground rules. Punishments for loose tongues ranged from fines to mutilation. In certain places, if you were caught lying under oath, you could lose your tongue entirely. One slip of speech and your voice, your most human feature, could be cut away. It's horrifying and absurd, like being permanently muted in real life. Historians still debate how widespread such punishments were, but the fear of them kept many mouths firmly shut. You pass a narrow alley where a man leans against a wall, head lowered. Rumor says he once cursed the local bishop during a drunken night. By dawn he was dragged before the manor court, fined beyond his means, and now spends his days muttering only to himself. No one dares answer him. His voice is poison, too dangerous to acknowledge. Even jokes could be perilous. A careless jest about the wrong person could be spun into sedition. Imagine cracking a medieval dad joke about the king's weight and suddenly finding yourself dangling from the gallows. Laughter wasn't harmless. It was loaded, a spark that could ignite your ruin, and the most unsettling part. Silence wasn't safety either. Sometimes failing to speak was its own crime. Refusing to swear loyalty, to answer a charge, or to confess under pressure could be taken as guilt. The law forced words out of you, then punished you for them. It was a trap. Language turned into chains. You tighten your cloak, realizing how much heavier the air feels. In this world, even your thoughts aren't safe if they slip into sound. Every sentence is a gamble, every whisper a risk. And as you walk on, you can't help but smirk at the irony. In a society built on endless rules, even silence could get you killed. The cobbled path pulls you toward a looming stone structure at the edge of the village. Its heavy wooden doors groan under the weight of centuries, and from within seeps a scent of incense mixed with wax and cold stone. This is not just a church, it's also a courtroom. In medieval Europe, the line between faith and law blurred so tightly that stepping into a sanctuary often meant stepping into judgment. The church held courts of its own, known as ecclesiastical courts, where sins and crimes mingled freely. Blasphemy, adultery, heresy, even skipping Sunday Mass could drag you here. And unlike the Lord's manorial justice, the church claimed authority over your soul. Imagine breaking a law where the punishment wasn't only a fine or beating, but eternal damnation. Talk about high stakes. Inside you picture rows of wooden benches, peasants shuffling nervously while clerics in dark robes read out charges in Latin, a language few villagers even understood. The mystery of it all only heightened the terror. To the average person, it might as well have been magic. You stood accused without even fully knowing what you were accused of. Historians still argue whether this deliberate obscurity was meant to protect doctrine or simply to keep ordinary folk in line. One case lingers in the records, a woman who claimed to hear saints speaking in her dreams. To her it was a gift. To the church it was suspicious, maybe even heretical. She was interrogated, her visions picked apart for traces of blasphemy. The verdict? Public penance and months of silence, forbidden to speak of her dreams again. The law had swallowed her gift and spat out fear. What makes it darker is that ecclesiastical courts sometimes competed with secular ones. Steal a loaf of bread, and you might face the Lord's stocks. Speak disrespectfully about a saint, and suddenly you were before the bishop. And sometimes both courts tried to claim you. Imagine being sued by your landlord and your priest at the same time. It was legal double jeopardy with a divine twist. You picture yourself standing before the altar-turned bench, candles flickering in the draught. The priest's voice echoes, his Latin phrases rolling like thunder you can't decipher. Did you sin? Did you trespass? Does it even matter? You nod, hoping submission spares you, though deep down you know the scales are already tipped. And sometimes, if the charge was severe enough, heresy, witchcraft, apostasy, your punishment could leap beyond earthly pain. Trials by the church often ended with excommunication, a word more terrifying than any lash. To be cast out wasn't just to lose your faith community. It was to become untouchable, damned, invisible in the eyes of both God and man. It was a punishment you carried every second, like a scar on the soul. You leave the shadow of the church with a shiver, realizing that here, law didn't just rule the body, it claimed the afterlife too. And in that grip you begin to wonder which prison was worse, the cell of stone or the cage of the spirit. The night air feels sharper as you leave the echo of the church bells behind. A narrow dirt road stretches ahead, lined with crooked fences and the low murmur of restless animals. Somewhere nearby, a group of villagers kneel before a torch, their hands raised as they swear loyalty to their lord. The sound of their voices rises and falls like a chant, each word binding tighter than rope. In medieval Europe, oaths weren't casual promises. They were sacred contracts, backed by divine authority and iron law. Break an oath, and you weren't. Just dishonest, you were a criminal, sometimes even a traitor. To swear falsely was to spit in the face of God, and punishments could be brutal. Some were fined heavily, others whipped, and in dire cases, executed for what was essentially the medieval version of breaking a pinky promise. You stop to watch as one man hesitates, his voice trembling on the words. Maybe he isn't sure he can keep his vow, or maybe he's simply afraid of the consequences of saying them aloud. Either way, the steward frowns, making a mark on his parchment. That mark is enough to shadow the man's life for years. It's chilling, the way silence alone could condemn you. Historians still debate how much of these oaths were sincere devotion and how much was sheer survival. After all, swearing loyalty to a lord who could crush you wasn't really a choice, it was self-preservation. And the darker irony? Lords themselves often broke their promises with little consequence, while peasants bore the full weight of failure. It's a bit like your boss demanding you show up early every day while he strolls in 2 hours late. The hypocrisy stings, but here it's fatal. One tale drifts from village to village, a farmer who swore to deliver half his crop but kept a little extra hidden for his starving family. When discovered, he wasn't just fined, he was dragged to the square, branded as a perjurer, and forced to kneel while his neighbors spat on him. The law wasn't punishing theft, it was punishing betrayal, the breaking of the spoken bond. And the shame of it echoed louder than the punishment itself. Even in personal life, oaths were inescapable. Marriage vows weren't only spiritual but also legal contracts, and breaking them could mean losing property, reputation, or even custody of children. Imagine a world where a simple word, I swear, wasn't just symbolic, but a legal trapdoor waiting to swing shut beneath you. As you move past the group of villagers, the torchlight flickers across their faces, hollow-eyed but determined. Their voices blend into the night, binding them all in invisible chains, and you walk on realizing that in this world, trust wasn't just fragile, it was enforced by fear, sealed with the weight of punishment. The sound of laughter drifts from a low-roofed tavern, the kind of laughter that grows louder with each gulp of ale. You push open the heavy door and step into a haze of smoke, heat, and spilled drink. Wooden mugs clatter on the tables, and villagers sway to the rhythm of drunken songs. For a fleeting moment it feels almost free, almost alive. But then your eyes catch the stern figure of the ale taster, standing in the corner. And you remember, even drunken joy was bound by law. In medieval Europe, drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was regulated like a matter of state. Lords and kings controlled the right to brew and sell alcohol, charging heavy taxes on beer, wine, and spirits. Step outside those rules and you weren't just a tavern keeper. You were a criminal. Imagine hosting a backyard barbecue today and being fined for every cup of homemade lemonade. Not exactly festive. What's stranger still were the punishments for drunkenness itself. In some towns, drinking too much wasn't just embarrassing, it was a crime. Public drunkenness could land you in the stocks, where you'd spend hours with a wooden collar around your neck, while your neighbors hurled rotten vegetables at your face. Sometimes fines were imposed, but for repeat offenders the punishment escalated. Whippings, branding, even exile for being unable to hold your liquor. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly about morality, or simply another way to squeeze coin from peasants, desperate for relief from their miserable lives. You glance at the tavern keeper, a wiry man polishing mugs with nervous hands. He's careful not to shortchange anyone, because taverns were under constant watch. Too much water in the beer? Fine. Too little foam? Fine. Sell a drink without paying the lord his cut? You guessed it. Fine. The tavern keeper's smile is brittle, a mask stretched thin over the fear of ruin. One story makes its way around the tables. A miller who brewed beer at home without paying tax. When discovered, his punishment was to drink his own sour brew until he collapsed while the villagers jeered. It sounds like slapstick, but the humiliation was real and the law made sure everyone remembered it. You sip from a mug pressed into your hand, the bitter taste biting at your tongue. It's warm, comforting, but heavy with the knowledge that this small pleasure could easily become your downfall. Even joy here was rationed, measured, and taxed. As you step back out into the cool night, the tavern door creaks shut behind you, cutting off the laughter. And once again you feel that familiar weight, the realization that in this world even happiness had a price, and the law was always there to collect. The night path leads you out of the village and into the shadow of a dense forest. Branches twist above you like gnarled fingers, and every rustle in the underbrush makes your heart leap. For most peasants, these woods weren't a place of freedom. They were a minefield of invisible laws. To hunt here without permission was to flirt with death. Game belonged to the Lord. Deer, boar, even rabbits were considered noble property, and killing one without leave was a crime so severe it could end your life. Imagine being hanged not for murder, but for daring to roast a rabbit when you were starving. It sounds absurd, but in medieval Europe, poaching was treason against the social order. You picture a man creeping through the trees, bow in hand, desperate to feed his family. The arrow flies true, the deer falls, and with it, his fate is sealed. Caught poaching, he might lose an ear, his hand, or his very head. In some regions, the punishment was blinding, leaving the offender alive but broken, a living warning to others. Historians still debate whether such harshness was truly enforced everywhere, or exaggerated by chroniclers, but even the rumor was enough to keep most peasants trembling. What makes it even stranger is how detailed these hunting laws were. Some decrees banned carrying bows within forests altogether. Others outlawed owning certain hunting dogs, unless you were of noble birth. The size of a dog's paw could literally decide whether it was legal for you to keep it. Imagine a medieval police officer measuring your beagle's foot before writing you a ticket. Ridiculous, yes, but deadly serious at the time. One tale lingers in the smoke of the hearth, a man accused of snaring a hare on the king's land. His punishment wasn't death, but something almost more humiliating. He was forced to march through the village with the dead hare tied around his neck, while children jeered and villagers spat. The hare rotted in the sun before he was finally allowed to remove it. His crime was forgotten by no one. As you push deeper into the forest, the silence thickens. You can almost feel the trees themselves watching, guarding their hidden laws. Each snap of a twig echoes like a warning, and you realize how terrifying it must have been to live in a world where hunger could drag you into crime, and crime could drag you to the gallows. You tug your cloak tighter, listening to the howl of a distant wolf. In the dark of the forest, it's not the wolf that scares you most, it's the thought of the Lord's men waiting in silence, ready to drag you out for daring to feed yourself. The trees thin, and the forest path empties into a wide clearing where two men face each other. One grips a sword, the other a wooden staff. Around them, villagers gather in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the combatants. This isn't sport, it's law. You've stumbled upon a trial by combat, the medieval version of May the Best Man Be Right. In an age where evidence was shaky and witnesses unreliable, sometimes disputes weren't settled by logic or testimony, but by brute force. The idea was simple. God would grant victory to the innocent. So if you were accused of theft, slander, or even murder, you might be forced to fight your accuser. Win and you were declared free. Lose and, well, you lost more than just your case. You feel the weight of the absurdity. Imagine suing someone over a property dispute today and being told to meet them in the parking lot with baseball bats to see who gets the deed. That's essentially how medieval justice sometimes worked. Historians still argue whether these combats were truly believed to reveal divine judgment, or if it was simply the most entertaining way for lords to settle quarrels while sipping wine from the sidelines. And it wasn't always fair combat. Nobles had access to fine swords and armor. Peasants might be given a stick, or even forced to fight in a muddy pit. Women accused of crimes weren't always spared either. Records tell of a strange practice in parts of Germany, where a woman fighting a man would be armed with a rock in a sack, while the man stood waist-deep in a hole with one arm tied. A bizarre attempt at balance, though hardly comforting if you were the one holding the sack. One legendary story recalls a man who demanded trial by combat to prove he hadn't stolen his neighbor's cow. They fought, mud splattering, the crowd cheering. In the end, the accused lost, and with his defeat he was not only declared guilty but stripped of property, left with nothing. The cow, of course, stayed with the victor. Justice served medieval style. As you watch the fighters circle, the crowd murmurs with anticipation. One slip, one misstep, and the outcome isn't just blood, it's law. The duel ends swiftly, one man crumpling into the dirt while the other raises his sword. The villagers cheer, not because they believe truth has triumphed, but because they've witnessed the raw theater of survival disguised as divine will. You step away from the clearing, shaken by the thought. In this world, innocence wasn't proven by truth. It was proven by how well you could swing a weapon. And if you couldn't fight, well then, you'd better pray. The clearing gives way to a narrow lane, leading toward a chapel where bells toll slowly, marking a wedding about to begin. You pause at the edge, watching villagers gather in their best, though best here means patched tunics and worn shoes. For them, marriage isn't just love and vows. It's a contract, a legal snare spun as tightly as any chain. In medieval Europe, the laws of marriage were a maze of obligations and restrictions. Who you married wasn't always your choice. Lords often demanded approval before peasants wed, sometimes even charging a fee known as merce. Imagine paying your boss just for the right to say "I do." Romantic, right? And if you couldn't afford the fee, the marriage might be delayed or worse, forbidden. Inside the chapel, a young couple trembles before the altar. They don't just speak words of devotion. They swear binding promises that the law will enforce. Infidelity wasn't only a personal betrayal, it was a crime, punishable by public humiliation, fines, or worse. And annulments? Forget the quick, clean paperwork of modern divorces. In this world, marriages were intended to last until death, or until the church decided otherwise, often after long, costly petitions. Historians still debate how strictly these marriage laws were enforced across Europe. In some places, the church emphasized the sacred bond of love. In others, it was more about property and alliances. Daughters were married off not for affection, but to secure land or livestock. Your heart's desires had little weight compared to your family's fortunes. One tale drifts on the village breeze, a peasant girl who fell in love with a shepherd from another manor. Their union was forbidden because it crossed territorial lines, and their families would have lost valuable labor. The lovers met in secret until they were caught. Their punishment: public penance, forced to parade barefoot around the village while carrying heavy stones as the crowd jeered. Their crime wasn't passion. It was stepping outside the invisible grid of legal control. Even within marriage, laws crept into the household. Husbands were granted broad authority over wives, and wives had few avenues to seek protection. The vows themselves carried legal weight, turning private promises into public obligations. Marriage wasn't merely about two people. It was about order, inheritance, and the stability of the feudal system. As the couple at the altar exchange vows, their voices tremble but firm. The crowd nods approvingly, not because of love's triumph, but because order has been preserved. Another contract sealed, another life tied into the web of law. You step back into the lane, realizing that in this world, even love was drafted, taxed, and punished if it strayed. The sweetest moments of human life were monitored not by choice, but by decree. You wander past the chapel, only to notice a group of villagers gathered near the market square. Their eyes aren't on the wares of merchants, but on one man's tunic, a fabric too fine, a color too bold. Whispers ripple through the crowd, and soon the steward steps forward, measuring the cloth with a glance sharper than any blade. You realize you're watching another law at work, the rules of dress known as sumptuary laws. In medieval Europe, clothing wasn't just fashion, it was regulation. Laws dictated who could wear silk, fur, bright dyes, or even certain hats. Nobles wrapped themselves in velvet and ermine, while peasants were confined to wool and linen. The logic was that outward appearance reinforced social order. You didn't just feel poor, you had to look poor. Imagine walking into a store today and being told you couldn't buy jeans because your job title didn't qualify. That was the world these people lived in. You study the villager's tunic, dyed a deep crimson, a color often reserved for nobility. The steward's voice rises, accusing him of breaking the law of appearance. Punishments varied. Fines, confiscation of the garment, or in harsher cases, public shame. Some towns forced offenders to wear their illegal clothing inside out, paraded through the streets for all to mock. Historians still debate whether these laws were truly enforced everywhere or mostly symbolic, but their presence alone shows how far control reached, even into your wardrobe. What's stranger is how specific these codes could be. In some places, women were forbidden to wear veils beyond a certain length unless of noble rank. Shoemakers could be fined for giving peasants pointed shoes, a style above their station. The details sound laughable now, but back then, they carried real weight. Dress above your rank, and you weren't just pretentious, you were a criminal. A story lingers of a merchant's wife who wore pearls at a feast, trying to appear wealthier than she was. Her punishment wasn't physical, but devastating nonetheless. Her family was fined so heavily they nearly lost their business. Her pearls became a curse, dragging them into debt for years. In this world, a single necklace could unravel an entire life. You feel your own cloak tighten around your shoulders. Plain wool, dull and scratchy, just as the law demands. And yet you can't help but smirk at the absurdity. A society so terrified of blurred lines that it policed fashion like it policed theft. Today's dress code at work might annoy you, but at least no one's threatening to seize your boots for being too fancy. As you leave the square, the steward holds the crimson tunic aloft like a trophy, proof that order has been preserved by stripping one man of his pride. And you walk on, reminded once again, in this world even self-expression could be a crime. The market hum fades as you follow the road toward a toll house, where a crooked wooden beam stretches across the path like a barrier. Beside it sits a weary collector with a box of coins, his face lit by the flickering torchlight. Villagers shuffle forward, dropping coins into the box, some reluctantly, others with visible resentment. This isn't charity. It's survival under the crushing weight of endless taxes. In medieval Europe, taxes came in more flavors than the bread on your table. You paid for land, livestock, tools, even for the right to grind your grain. And the strangest part? Many taxes weren't based on wealth, but on sheer existence. The infamous hearth tax charged families simply for owning a fireplace. The window tax demanded coin for every opening that let in light. And yes, even salt, the very thing that kept food from rotting, was heavily taxed, turning every pinch into a reminder of the Lord's grip. You watch as a woman places 2 small coins on the table, her hands trembling. She's paying the smoke tax, a fee for the privilege of letting her chimney puff into the air. Imagine being charged today every time you boiled water for tea. Absurd, yes, but entirely real. Historians still argue whether these taxes were designed to raise money efficiently or to remind peasants constantly of their place beneath authority. Probably both. And the cruelty didn't stop at absurdity. If you couldn't pay, collectors might seize your tools, livestock, or even your bedding. One tale tells of a farmer who failed to pay his salt tax. The steward not only took his cart, but also his only cow, leaving his family unable to plow their fields. The debt was paid, but the family was ruined. The law was satisfied, though mercy was nowhere in sight. You smirk grimly at the irony. People sometimes stuffed cloth in their windows to avoid the window tax, turning homes dark and airless. It was like a medieval version of turning off Wi-Fi to dodge subscription fees. Clever but miserable. As the line of villagers dwindles, the collector closes his box with a sharp snap, the sound echoing like a verdict. You feel the weight of it pressing on you too, as if every breath here carries a hidden price. In this world, nothing is free, not the smoke from your fire, not the light through your window, not even the salt on your tongue. You step past the toll house into the deepening night, realizing that these laws weren't only about punishment. They were about draining every drop of life until obedience became second nature. And in that endless exchange, you begin to wonder how much of survival was simply learning which taxes you could afford to break. The road winds past the toll house and climbs a low hill where the night air turns colder. In the distance, a crowd gathers around a roaring fire. At first, you think it's a celebration. But then you see the stake planted firmly in the ground, the ropes, the terrified figure bound tight. This is no festival. This is a trial for witchcraft. Few things reveal the cruelty of medieval law more starkly than the fear of witches. Whisper that someone spoke strange words over a sick cow, or that a neighbor's bread rose too high, and suspicion could bloom into accusation. Once accused, You were tangled in a nightmare where logic vanished. The law didn't need proof, it needed fear. You hear the priest's voice rise, calling out charges of sorcery, curses, and dealings with the devil. The crowd murmurs, some crossing themselves, others eager for spectacle. What's unsettling is how ordinary the accused looks. Just a woman, hair tangled, eyes wide with dread. Yet the law has transformed her into a symbol of chaos, an enemy of both God and man. Punishments for witchcraft varied, sometimes fines or penance, but in darker corners of Europe, fire and rope were the preferred verdicts. Trials could be grotesque parodies of justice, dunking a woman in water to see if she floated, proof of guilt if she did, proof of death if she didn't. It was the kind of logic that made survival impossible. Historians still debate whether these early trials were truly about belief in magic or whether they masked deeper fears of women, of outsiders, to have anything the system couldn't control. One chilling story recalls a healer accused after a nobleman's child died, despite her remedies. She was tied and thrown into a river. She sank, proving her innocence, though of course she drowned in the process. Justice declared itself satisfied, even as her body washed downstream. The cruelty wasn't hidden, it was paraded, a warning etched in water and memory. You watch as the flames crackle higher, sparks leaping into the night sky like desperate prayers. The woman screams once, then falls silent, her body swallowed by fire. The villagers avert their eyes, but no one speaks. Silence here is survival. And then the absurd detail strikes you. Sometimes even animals were accused of witchcraft. Cats, goats, even birds stood trial, as though law itself had lost its mind. Imagine blaming your dog for bad weather and dragging him before a judge. Ridiculous yet deadly serious in this world. The fire dies down to embers, leaving smoke curling into the night. You turn away, the acrid scent clinging to your cloak. In this world, fear was law, and the law burned brightest when it hunted shadows. The smoke from the witch's pyre still clings to your clothes as you walk down a narrow lane where chickens scatter at your feet and dogs bark behind fences. The night feels oddly alive with their noise, and then it strikes you, here even animals weren't beyond the reach of law. In medieval Europe, creatures could be, and often were, put on trial. Imagine the scene. A pig accused of killing a child is dragged before a court, dressed in rough clothes like a criminal. Judges, clerics, even notaries all assemble, solemn as if presiding over a king's case. The charges are read aloud. The pig grunts. And then comes the verdict. Execution, often by hanging just like a human criminal. It sounds absurd, almost like a grim fairy tale, but records confirm it happened across Europe. You pass a stable where a horse snorts softly, and you can't help but wonder, how many times did fear and superstition twist justice into parody? One famous case recalls a swarm of locusts summoned to court for destroying crops. They were officially excommunicated by a bishop, as though insects would tremble at the threat of hell. Historians still debate whether these animal trials were sincere legal proceedings or elaborate rituals meant to reassure frightened communities that someone, anything, was being punished. Children whisper about a story from a nearby town. A rooster accused of laying an egg, said to be the work of the devil. The poor bird was sentenced to death, its supposed crime being the impossible. You smirk at the thought. Talk about being punished for being productive. But beneath the humor lies terror. If a rooster wasn't safe, how much safer was a peasant? Even pets weren't spared. Dogs that bit nobles, cats that strayed too far into churches. Each could find themselves under judgment. The absurdity served a purpose, though. By holding trials, authorities showed that the law reached into every corner of life, natural or supernatural. Nothing was beyond its net. You pause by a fence where a cow chews lazily on hay, unaware of its potential fate. In this world, your livestock could be both your livelihood and your liability, subject to laws as harsh as those for men. And the cruelest irony. Sometimes animals received better legal representation than peasants, with appointed advocates speaking on their behalf, while villagers often stood alone. As you leave the lane behind, the barking fades into the night. You feel a chill, realizing that here, the law wasn't just about controlling people. It was about controlling the very rhythm of life itself. And in such a world, innocence was never guaranteed, not for man nor beast. The lane opens into the village square again, but this time it's crowded. Torches blaze. Children sit on their parents' shoulders, and the air buzzes with uneasy excitement. In the center stands a wooden platform, fitted with stocks and whipping posts. Tonight isn't a festival, it's punishment day. Public punishment was a cornerstone of medieval law. It wasn't enough to fine or jail offenders. They had to be displayed, turned into living lessons. A thief might be nailed by the ear to the pillory, forced to stand for hours while villagers jeered through mud or worse. An adulterer might be paraded through town wearing a ridiculous costume, humiliation layered atop pain. The cruelty wasn't hidden, it was the point. The law wanted everyone to see and remember. You watch as a man is dragged forward, his hands bound. His crime? Selling watered-down beer. The punishment? A dunking stool, where he's plunged into a trough again and again until his teeth chatter from the cold. The crowd roars with laughter, children clapping as if it's theatre. And in a way it is. Justice here doubles as entertainment, grim reality wrapped in carnival. Historians still debate how effective these punishments were. Did they truly reduce crime, or did they simply feed the appetite for spectacle? Some suggest they were less about deterrence and more about reinforcing the hierarchy. This could be you, stay in line. Either way, the scars ran deeper than the skin. You notice a boy whispering to his mother, pointing at the stocks where another villager sits with a sign hung around his neck, "Liar." His head and hands are locked, his face red from tomatoes hurled by neighbors. The mother shushes her son, warning him never to speak lies. Lesson learned, the law hopes. But you wonder, what if he was innocent? What if his only crime was offending someone powerful? The absurdity hits when you recall stories of punishments, tailored almost like cruel jokes. Bakers caught cheating customers might be strapped to their own ovens. Fishmongers selling bad catch were sometimes forced to carry rotten fish around town until the stench drove everyone mad. Justice with a sense of theatre, dark, mocking theatre. As the crowd disperses, the punished limp away, dripping, bruised, or shamed. You step back into the shadows, unsettled. In this world, law wasn't just about punishment, it was about performance. And the audience was always ready to cheer. The square empties slowly, torches guttering as villagers drift home. But above it all, the manor looms like a watchful eye. Its banners snap in the wind, bright against the night sky, and you can almost feel their weight pressing down on the village below. For here, the harshest laws weren't about bread or taxes. They were about protecting the king and nobles. Speak a careless word about the sovereign, and you weren't just rude, you were guilty of treason. A muttered complaint about high taxes, a drunken jest about a noble's fat belly. Even a poorly timed grimace could be twisted into insult. Treason laws were deliberately vague, a net cast wide enough to snare almost anyone. And once caught, there was little chance of wriggling free. You remember tales of men hauled before the Crown's court for saying the king was too fond of wine. Was it gossip? Probably. But in the eyes of the law, it was sedition, and sedition demanded punishment. At best, fines and humiliation. At worst, the scaffold. Imagine cracking a bad joke at work and ending up headless in the morning. It gives office politics a whole new meaning. Historians still argue how much of these laws were truly enforced versus wielded selectively. Nobles, after all, could tolerate grumbling when it stayed small. But when whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into chants, suddenly words became daggers. And the law was quick to strike first. You picture a bard standing in a tavern, singing verses that mock a local lord. His audience laughs nervously, glancing at the door. By morning, the bard is gone, dragged to the dungeons for daring to turn law into a rhyme. One song could be his last, not because of its melody, but because of its audacity. The punishments for treason were often designed to terrify. Executions weren't swift. They were elaborate, public, and unforgettable. A man accused of plotting against a king might be hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts displayed across the land as grim reminders. A single head on a pike did more to enforce obedience than 1,000 guards. As you look up at the manor's torchlit windows, you smirk bitterly. In this world, the law didn't just protect rulers, it deified them. To insult the king was to insult the order of the universe itself. And so you keep your thoughts locked tight, because here, silence isn't golden, it's survival. The manor's torchlight fades as you wander down a narrow road that twists into darkness. Ahead rises a squat stone tower, its iron-barred windows oozing a faint, sickly glow. A foul stench seeps from its walls, damp straw, rusted chains, and something worse, the reek of despair. You've reached the prison, where medieval law kept its grip not just on the body but on the spirit. Medieval dungeons weren't designed for rehabilitation. They weren't even truly meant for long-term sentences. More often, they were holding pits, places to break people before trial or to rot them until families paid ransom or debts. Cells were cramped, with ceilings so low you couldn't stand upright. Chains clamped ankles to walls and vermin scuttled freely over straw mats soaked in filth. The punishment wasn't just confinement. It was humiliation, hunger, and disease. You step closer to the barred door and hear the cough of a prisoner inside. He isn't a murderer or a thief. His crime? Failure to pay the Lord's taxes. Others whisper of men jailed for fishing in the wrong stream or refusing to swear an oath. The prison becomes a catch-all net, trapping anyone inconvenient to the system. Historians still debate whether these dungeons were truly overflowing with criminals or deliberately used to intimidate entire villages through fear. Some punishments were more creative. There are records of prisoners chained in iron collars so heavy they couldn't lie down, forced to sleep standing like beasts. Others were sealed into tiny wooden boxes with only their heads sticking out, left to endure the jeers of passers-by. The law was inventive when it came to suffering. One grim tale lingers, a noble's debtor thrown into a pit beneath the castle. His family begged for release, scraping together coins for months. By the time they returned, he was already dead, his bones gnawed by rats. His sentence was complete, but so was the family's ruin. You press against the damp stone, imagining the hopelessness inside. Some cells had no windows at all, leaving prisoners in perpetual dark. Others were positioned deliberately below privies, so waste dripped into the cells. It's almost comedic in its cruelty, if it weren't so horrific. Imagine flushing a toilet and realizing the guy beneath you is serving a life sentence. As you step away, the tower looms behind you like a hungry beast, its maw still filled with unseen captives. And you realize that in this world, prison wasn't about law and order. It was about demonstrating power. The bars didn't just hold bodies, they held the entire village in line, one groan and rattle of chains at a time. The prison tower fades behind you as the path bends toward open farmland. The night air smells of damp earth and straw, but it's heavy with tension. A line of peasants trudges toward the manor's granary, bent beneath sacks of grain. Their faces are pale, eyes hollow, as though every kernel weighs not just on their backs but on their souls. This is the law of harvest, where survival itself was regulated. In medieval Europe, crops weren't truly yours. A portion, often the best portion, belonged to the Lord. Failing to hand over enough grain wasn't seen as misfortune. It was treated as theft. Imagine a poor harvest leaving you with almost nothing, yet you're still expected to fill the Lord's stores first. Hungry? Too bad. The law didn't care about your stomach. It cared about order. You watch a steward measure sacks with meticulous precision. Too light, and the farmer is accused of holding back. Sometimes fines followed, sometimes beatings. In harsher regions, the punishment could mean being labeled a criminal, branded or jailed for stealing from the manor that owned you. Historians still argue whether these strict laws were about protecting noble wealth or ensuring famine didn't spark rebellion. Likely it was both. One tale whispers of a village fined after failing to meet its grain quota during a flood. The people had eaten their seed corn to survive, and when planting season came, they had nothing left. The Lord's answer wasn't mercy, it was punishment. The result? Starvation stretched into the next year, and the law's lesson was clear. Obedience mattered more than life. Even stranger were laws about when you could harvest. In some places, villagers couldn't gather crops until the Lord's men had taken their share, no matter how ripe the field stood. It's like owning a fridge full of food, but being forbidden to open it until your landlord has eaten his fill. Absurd, yet utterly binding. You pass a barn where a woman hides a small bundle of grain beneath the hay. It's a desperate gamble. If caught, she could face confiscation of her animals or worse. But if she doesn't, her children may not survive the winter. It's a cruel equation. Obey the law and starve, or break it and risk everything. The granary door slams shut as the last sack is taken in. The peasants disperse, shoulders slumped, their bellies still empty. You walk on, the weight of their burden pressing into your chest. In this world, even the harvest, the purest act of survival, was shackled by law. And breaking those laws was as easy as breathing, as impossible to avoid as hunger itself. The fields fade into open ground where campfires flicker in the distance. The air smells of smoke and iron, and you hear the clatter of armor. A band of soldiers trudges past, mud spattering their boots, faces weary from war. Yet among them walks not only knights but also shackled peasants, pressed into service under laws that blurred the line between citizen and soldier. In medieval Europe, war crimes weren't just atrocities committed on the battlefield, they were also accusations leveled against ordinary people. Looting, disobedience, or even refusing conscription could all be judged as crimes against the crown. Imagine being dragged from your farm, handed a spear, and told that deserting meant death. That was the reality for many peasants, who served not by choice but by decree. One soldier whispers about a man who refused to march, claiming he had a family to feed. The Lord branded him a coward and hanged him at dawn, his body left for others to see. Historians still debate whether these harsh punishments were truly about maintaining armies or about reinforcing control at home. Either way, the message was clear. Loyalty was law and war demanded obedience. Even knights weren't free from scrutiny. A noble who broke the codes of chivalry, pillaging too greedily or harming a fellow noble's vassals, could be charged with dishonor, stripped of lands, or cast into disgrace. Of course, too greedy was a flexible term. The spoils of war were allowed, but only when they flowed upward to those in power. You hear another tale of mercenaries accused of slaughtering civilians in a captured town. Instead of justice, they were fined lightly and sent on their way because the lords needed their swords. The law here wasn't about morality, it was about usefulness. If you were valuable to the system, your crimes were overlooked. If not, even hesitation could hang you. You pass a group of peasants dragging wagons of supplies, their eyes downcast. For them, war was just another form of taxation, another burden laid heavy by decree. Their sons marched with the army, their daughters fed soldiers, and their homes emptied into supply carts. Any refusal, treason, and treason meant death. The fires crackle as you leave the camp behind, the night swallowing the sound of marching feet. You realize that in this world, war itself was law, and the battlefield was just another courtroom, where the verdict was always written in blood. The war camp fades behind you, and soon the road opens onto pasture land. Moonlight spills across fields dotted with cattle, sheep, and goats, their silhouettes moving slowly in the night. At first it feels peaceful, almost gentle, but then you notice a nervous farmer chasing after a cow that's wandered across a fence line. His panic isn't about the animal getting lost, it's about the law. In medieval Europe, livestock weren't just property, they were potential court cases waiting to happen. If your cow strayed into a lord's field, or your pigs rooted in someone else's garden, the law came down hard. The animal might be seized, slaughtered, or sold, while you, the owner, faced fines so steep they could ruin your household. It wasn't simply about property damage. It was about hierarchy, control, and the idea that even beasts had to obey the social order. You hear the farmer's wife whisper that a neighbor once lost his entire herd because one sheep wandered into the wrong meadow. The punishment was crippling. The animals confiscated, the family left destitute. Historians still debate whether these penalties were truly about protecting crops or about keeping peasants in constant fear. After all, animals stray by nature, but here their wandering was treated as rebellion. Sometimes the punishments bordered on absurdity. Records tell of pigs that were executed for trampling a noble's vineyard, their bodies hanged in the village square as warnings. Yes, executed pigs. Imagine your dog digging up a neighbor's garden today and being sentenced to death by hanging. Ridiculous yet deadly serious in its time. You smirk at another strange detail. Some villages required owners to pay a fee just to let their animals graze in certain fields. It was like medieval subscription farming. Forgetting to pay meant your goat's midnight snack could cost you your life savings. One chilling tale tells of a farmer's ox that gored a noble's servant. The ox was tried in court, found guilty, and publicly slaughtered. But the farmer also lost his home and land, the reasoning being that if his animal was dangerous, so was he. The punishment rippled outward, destroying more than just one life. As you watch the frantic farmer finally herd his cow back into its pen, you feel a pang of unease. In this world, survival wasn't just about feeding your animals. It was about keeping them perfectly obedient, as if the law expected cows to read the rulebook. And when they didn't, it was you who paid the price. The night deepens as you approach a small chapel, glowing faintly with candlelight. A hush lingers in the air, broken only by the low murmur of villagers filing inside. At the door stands a priest, stern-eyed, watching each face as though weighing their souls. You hesitate, because here in medieval Europe, even a whisper against the sacred order could destroy you. Blasphemy and heresy weren't minor offenses. They were among the deadliest crimes under medieval law. Question a priest, doubt a miracle, or mutter a careless joke about a saint, and you could find yourself accused of insulting God. The punishments? Severe, ranging from fines and penance to public humiliation, or in darker cases, the flames of execution. Imagine cracking a joke about heaven today and waking up tied to a stake tomorrow. That was the edge people lived on. Inside, a man is dragged before the altar. His crime? Allegedly mocking a relic, a bone said to belong to a saint. The crowd gasps as the charges are read, though no one seems certain what he actually said. That didn't matter. In this world, suspicion alone could be damning. Historians still debate whether these trials were genuine spiritual safeguards or political weapons, silencing voices that threatened church power. Probably they were both. One tale you overhear, a young scholar who questioned why holy water didn't cure the plague. His logic was sharp, his doubt sincere, but the church branded him a blasphemer. He was forced to stand barefoot in the snow, holding a candle until it burned his hand, a living warning of what happened when curiosity collided with law. The absurdity could be cruelly comic, too. Records speak of animals excommunicated for making noise during sermons, or of peasants fined for sneezing too loudly in church, as though their lungs were in league with the devil. Ridiculous yet deadly serious when the priest's word carried the force of law. You watch as the accused man at the altar is sentenced to wear a heavy wooden cross on his back for a year, trudging through every service in public shame. His eyes glisten with fear, his lips sealed tight now. A single whispered doubt has turned into a punishment that will shadow him for months. As you slip out into the night air, the chapel's bells toll solemnly. They sound less like a call to prayer and more like a warning. In this world, even your thoughts were on trial, and a single careless word could condemn you. The chapel bells fade behind you, replaced by the clatter of wooden wheels and the sharp cry of merchants hawking wares. The market is alive even under moonlight, stalls crowded with sacks of salt, bolts of cloth, and barrels of ale. Yet beneath the bustle, tension hums. For here, trade itself is shackled by law, and every coin exchanged carries the risk of ruin. In medieval Europe, merchants lived under a dense thicket of regulations. Prices weren't always free to rise or fall. Lords and councils often fixed them, punishing anyone who charged too much or sold too little. Weights and measures were strictly controlled. Cheat by shaving a grain from the scale, and you could find yourself whipped, fined, or worse. Imagine the modern police kicking down your door because your bathroom scale was 2 ounces off. You pause by a stall where a man sells bolts of wool. His nervous glances aren't about thieves, they're about inspectors. If caught with cloth dyed in forbidden colors or woven in unlicensed mills, he could lose his goods and his livelihood in one blow. Historians still debate whether such regulations protected buyers or simply lined the coffers of lords and guilds. Either way, they kept merchants walking a razor's edge. One story drifts among the stalls, a baker accused of shorting customers on bread weight. His punishment wasn't just a fine. He was tied to a cart and paraded through the streets with loaves strung around his neck, each one a symbol of his crime. The villagers jeered, tossing crumbs at him. Justice wasn't quiet. It was loud, public, and humiliating. Even stranger, entire towns could be punished for violating trade laws. If merchants refused to pay tolls, lords might seize goods, shut markets, or strip charters. It was economic warfare disguised as law. And for ordinary villagers, that meant empty stalls, higher prices, and hunger. You smirk when you recall records of fishmongers punished for selling spoiled catch. Instead of a simple fine, they were sometimes forced to carry the stinking fish through town until the smell clung to their skin for days. Absurd, yes, but unforgettable. A punishment that ensured no one forgot the rules. As you move past the stalls, you notice buyers counting coins with trembling hands, merchants measuring salt twice before pouring. The market should feel free, alive, but here every sale is a gamble, every bargain shadowed by fear. In this world, trade isn't opportunity. It's survival under the watchful eyes of law. The market noise drifts away as you follow a narrow street toward a tavern, where smoke seeps through the rafters and the smell of roasting meat curls into the night. Inside, long tables groan under platters of food, bread, stews, roasted fowl. The sight should comfort you, but instead it prickles your skin, because here even eating was bound by law. In medieval Europe, food wasn't simply a matter of appetite. It was wrapped in religious calendars, fasting rules, and strict prohibitions. Break them and you weren't just sinning, you were breaking the law. During Lent, meat was forbidden. On Fridays, fish was mandatory. Fail to obey, and punishments could range from fines to public penance. Imagine being arrested today because you snuck a cheeseburger on a Friday. Not exactly finger-licking good. You watch as a young man nervously chews bread while others glance at his plate. He's dared to eat meat on a fasting day. The tavern keeper shifts uneasily, because serving forbidden food was just as dangerous as eating it. Both could be punished, sometimes more harshly for the seller than the buyer. Historians still debate whether these laws were genuinely about faith, or whether they doubled as clever tools of social control, ensuring the church and crown always had their hands on the dinner table. Some cases seem almost comical in hindsight. Records speak of people fined for eating eggs during Lent, or entire families forced to parade through towns, carrying the very food they'd illegally consumed. One tale tells of a butcher who sold sausages during Lent. His punishment was to hang them around his neck and walk through the village while everyone laughed and jeered. Humiliating, yes, but also terrifying. The rules went beyond religion, too. Certain foods were reserved for nobles, exotic spices, sugar, even particular cuts of meat. Peasants caught indulging could face penalties, as if taste itself was a crime. It wasn't just about calories. It was about hierarchy, each bite reinforcing who you were allowed to be. You sip from a mug of thin ale, noticing how carefully the tavern keeper watches his guests. He must balance hunger, faith, and fear with every ladle he serves. Too generous, and he risks suspicion. Too stingy, and he angers his customers. Either way, the law looms like a shadow at the end of the table. As you step back into the night, the laughter from the tavern fades behind you. Your stomach feels heavy, not from food, but from the knowledge that here even a meal could betray you. In this world, hunger wasn't the only danger. Appetite itself was a crime waiting to happen. The tavern fades behind you, and soon you find yourself near a small cluster of cottages. The muffled sound of crying drifts from one of them, high-pitched and fragile. You edge closer and glimpse a boy, no older than 7, standing outside with a rope tied loosely around his wrist. His father whispers harshly, urging him to stand still because even children weren't spared from the iron grip of medieval law. In this world, age did not grant immunity. Children could be dragged before manorial courts accused of theft, disobedience, or worse. A boy who stole apples might be whipped in public. A girl who spoke rudely to a noble could be fined or beaten. Sometimes punishments matched those of adults. Branding, mutilation, even execution. Imagine grounding a child today by confiscating their toys. But back then, the law confiscated their childhood. One chilling record tells of a 9-year-old boy hanged for stealing bread. To modern eyes, it seems unthinkable. Yet in that time, law saw no difference between small hands and grown ones. Historians still debate whether such extreme cases were rare exceptions or part of a broader pattern. Either way, the fear was real enough to keep children cowed long. Before they understood the rules, you hear villagers whisper about the scare stocks where misbehaving children were locked briefly in tiny wooden frames as warnings. Sometimes it was theater meant to frighten them straight. But sometimes the punishments turned harsher, leaving bruises or scars that lasted long into adulthood. Childhood wasn't innocence, it was probation, and the law stretched beyond discipline. Orphans could be seized by lords, their labor sold as servants or apprentices. Children born out of wedlock were branded with shame, denied inheritance, their very existence treated as a legal offense. Even play carried risk. Games mistaken for gambling could spark punishment, laughter turning into lashes in the blink of an eye. You glance again at the boy by the cottage. His father unties the rope and the child rubs his wrist, tears streaking his face. He isn't a criminal, just a boy, but the fear in his eyes tells you everything. In this world, the law didn't wait for adulthood. It began the moment you could walk. As you walk on, the cries fade, replaced by a heavy silence, and you realize that here, childhood wasn't protection. It was only another stage of vulnerability, another reminder that law spared no one, no matter how small. The silence of the cottages gives way to the creak of wagon wheels and the distant clang of hooves on stone. You follow the road until it bends toward a crossroads, where travelers huddle nervously around a small fire. Their eyes dart into the shadows, hands clutching knives or sticks. It doesn't take long to understand why. These roads are hunting grounds for bandits, and the law's answer to highway crime was as brutal as the crime itself. In medieval Europe, robbing travelers was treated as one of the most heinous offenses. Roads were lifelines for trade, communication, and armies. Threaten them, and you threatened the entire order. Highwaymen, when caught, were rarely given mercy. Hanging was the standard punishment, and their bodies often left dangling along the roadside as a gruesome warning. Imagine driving today and passing a billboard with actual corpses, legal advertising for obedience. You picture a gang ambushing a merchant cart, slashing ropes, scattering goods. If caught, they might be executed within days, without lengthy trials. And the cruelty didn't stop there. Some were broken on the wheel, limbs shattered one by one before being left to die. Others were burned, their ashes scattered to erase their memory. Historians still debate whether these punishments reduced crime or simply fed the hunger for spectacle. Either way, the roads never truly became safe. Not all accused were guilty, though. Tales linger of poor men hanged for carrying knives too large, branded as highway robbers with no proof. Sometimes a noble's missing goods were enough to condemn the nearest unlucky peasant. In this world, proximity to crime could be as fatal as guilt itself. You hear the crackle of the traveler's fire, as one man whispers about a bandit known as Black Will, who robbed nobles but shared loot with peasants. Some called him criminal, others a folk hero. The law called him dangerous. When he was finally caught, he wasn't just executed, his head was nailed above the city gates. Justice or revenge disguised as law. The line blurred as easily as the night mist. As you walk past the crossroads, a gallows looms against the moonlight, a shadow swinging gently in the breeze. The body is gone, but the rope still hangs, frayed and silent, like a reminder carved into the sky. The roads belong to power, not to you. The gallows fade behind you as the path winds into a quiet hamlet. The houses here look worn, their roofs sagging like tired shoulders. Through one doorway you glimpse a family huddled together, arguing in hushed tones over a scrap of parchment. Their voices tremble not with anger but with fear. You realize they're dividing property, and in this world, inheritance could be as dangerous as theft. Medieval inheritance laws were a tangled web, meant to protect noble estates and preserve order. For peasants, land was often too scarce to divide. The eldest son, through primogeniture, usually inherited everything. Younger siblings? They were left with nothing, forced to beg, marry strategically, or turn to the church. Imagine being told that your future depended entirely on whether you were lucky enough to be born first. But the law could be even harsher. Daughters in many regions couldn't inherit land at all unless no sons existed, and even then, marriage often transferred their rights to their husbands. Families sometimes saw daughters as bargaining chips, trading them into unions to secure alliances or debts. Historians still debate whether this practice protected estates from fracturing or simply cemented inequality across generations. You overhear the family's quarrel. One brother insists the land should be split. The other clutches the parchment, declaring the Lord's decree forbids it. The sister sits silently, knowing her claim is already erased by law. What was meant to bind families together often tore them apart. Inheritance disputes filled courts, sparking feuds that lasted decades. Some ended in violence, others in ruinous legal battles. Records tell of brothers dragging each other before manorial courts, only to be fined so heavily that the land they fought over slipped back into the Lord's hands. It was a cruel joke. Either you lost to your sibling or you lost to the system. One tale haunts the villages still, a widow who tried to claim her late husband's land to feed her children. The Lord denied her, declaring the fields would revert to the manor. Desperate, she planted crops anyway. For her defiance, she was fined beyond her means, her tools seized and her children sent into servitude. Her attempt at survival was transformed into crime. As you step away from the cottage, the arguing fades into the night. But the image lingers, families ripped apart not by choice but by the invisible hand of law dictating who deserved to survive. In this world, inheritance wasn't just about property. It was about power, control, and the cruel arithmetic of birth. The cottages thin, giving way to a broad dirt road that stretches across the countryside. A few weary travellers shuffle past, carrying papers stamped with crude seals. Others slink through hedgerows, glancing nervously at the horizon. And suddenly it clicks. This isn't freedom of travel. This is permission to exist on the move. In medieval Europe, movement itself was often regulated. Many lords required peasants to obtain written permission before leaving their village. Travel without documents could mark you as a runaway serf, a vagrant, or even a spy. The roads weren't open paths. They were legal tripwires. Imagine needing a hall pass not just in school, but for every step outside your street. You watch as a man is stopped at a roadside post by guards who demand to see his writ of passage. He fumbles in his pouch, finally producing a crumpled parchment. Without it, he might have been fined, beaten, or dragged back to his manor in chains. In harsher regions, repeat offenders were branded with hot irons, an inescapable mark of disobedience. Historians still debate whether these travel laws were meant to secure order or to prevent lords from losing labourers who might seek better lives elsewhere. Probably it was both. One tale drifts among the travellers' campfires, a woman who fled her village during famine searching for food. She was caught miles away, accused of trespassing into another lord's domain. Her punishment wasn't prison. It was forced labour in that very manner, her crime turning her into property once more. Her attempt at survival became a chain. What's more, merchants were heavily taxed at every border, forced to pay tolls for crossing bridges, entering towns, or even carrying goods through certain forests. It was like medieval DLC. You bought the right to travel, but every step unlocked a new fee. And if you couldn't pay, your goods were confiscated, sometimes your freedom along with them. The absurdity surfaces in a story about a pilgrim traveling without papers to visit a shrine. Though his journey was religious, he was arrested as a vagabond. Only after swearing oaths, paying fines, and spending weeks in custody was he allowed to continue. His sin wasn't disbelief, it was walking the wrong road without permission. As you follow the dirt road into the night, you feel the invisible lines stretching across the land, binding every traveller to the whim of parchment and seal. In this world, the law didn't just watch over your village. It followed you on every step, every mile, every path you dared to tread. The dirt road bends toward a small green where villagers gather in the pale moonlight. Some toss dice, others laugh over rough wooden boards scratched with marks. Yet their joy feels fragile, edged with fear. For here in medieval Europe, even the simple act of passing time could land you in trouble. The law often regulated leisure, seeing it not as harmless fun but as potential disorder. Gambling, dice games, and idle gatherings were frequently outlawed. The reason? Authorities feared that play bred laziness, sin, or rebellion. A man rolling dice wasn't just wasting time. He was undermining the moral fabric of society, at least according to the law. Imagine being fined for playing a quick round of cards after dinner. Not exactly a relaxing evening. You notice a boy tossing dice against a wall, only to freeze when a constable approaches. The dice vanish into his tunic, but too late. The officer seizes him, accusing him of unlawful play. The punishment? Likely a fine, maybe a whipping. The boy's wide eyes make it clear. For him, this is no game anymore. Historians still debate how much these laws were enforced versus ignored in practice. Some towns cracked down fiercely, while others tolerated games as long as they didn't disrupt work. But the fact that leisure itself was criminalized shows how tightly rulers tried to control every corner of daily life. And it wasn't just games. In some regions, singing bawdy songs, telling obscene jokes, or dancing too wildly could all attract fines. The law intruded into laughter, turning joy into risk. One recorded case tells of villagers punished for holding an unauthorized May Day celebration. Dancing around a pole was treated like rebellion. Their fine nearly bankrupted the entire village. Absurdity lingers in the detail. Some rulers banned certain board games because they distracted soldiers from archery practice. So imagine being scolded not for skipping work, but for choosing checkers over target practice. It sounds laughable, but here it was deadly serious. You step back from the green, watching the villagers scatter as the constable marches away with the boy. The laughter fades, replaced by silence, and you realize in this world even killing time could kill your freedom. The laughter of the green vanishes behind you, as the road dips into a darker stretch. A small chapel looms ahead, its doors barred tight, while outside a man in tattered clothes pleads with a group of villagers. His accent is strange, his cloak patched with foreign cloth. You realize he's not from here, and that alone could be dangerous. In medieval Europe, being an outsider was almost a crime in itself. Laws against vagrancy and outsiders were harsh. Strangers entering a village without permission risked being accused of spying, trespassing, or carrying disease. The unfamiliar was feared, and fear became law. Imagine taking a weekend trip today and being arrested simply because no one recognized your face. You watch as the villagers whisper. Some want to offer bread. Others shake their heads, wary of punishment. Hospitality, once sacred, had become criminalized. In many towns, helping a stranger without permission could earn you fines, suspicion, or worse. Historians still debate whether these rules were driven by real threats of war and plague or by sheer paranoia. Either way, the effect was the same. Strangers weren't welcome. A tale surfaces of a wanderer who sought shelter in a barn during a storm. The next day he was dragged before the manor court, accused of trespassing and theft, though he had taken nothing. His punishment? A whipping in exile from the region. His only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And sometimes entire groups were targeted. Laws expelled Jews, Romani, and other minorities from towns, branding them as perpetual outsiders. These weren't isolated incidents. They were legal decrees written and enforced with brutal efficiency. The law turned identity itself into guilt. The absurdity seeps in when you recall that some towns demanded strangers carry special tokens or bells to announce themselves, like human alarms. One unlucky traveler who forgot his token was beaten before being tossed into the next village, where the process started again. You step closer to the chapel and see the stranger finally turned away, his shoulders slumping as he disappears into the night. No crime committed, yet punished all the same. In this world, belonging wasn't about community, it was about legality. And without the right seal or face, you had no place at all. The stranger's footsteps fade into the dark, and you wander toward the edge of the village where a faint glow leaks from a hut. Inside, bundles of herbs hang from the rafters, their scent sharp and earthy. A woman grinds roots with a stone pestle, her hands practiced, her movements steady. Yet she glances at the door every few seconds, as if expecting it to burst open. Because here, medicine itself could be a crime. In medieval Europe, healing wasn't always welcomed. It was regulated, scrutinized, sometimes condemned. Herbal remedies and folk cures, passed down through generations, were tolerated until they weren't. A poultice that cured one man's fever could, in another's eyes, look like witchcraft. And the line between healer and heretic was as thin as a single accusation. You watch as the woman mixes herbs into a paste, whispering prayers over the bowl. To her it's both medicine and tradition, but if the local priest deemed her prayers improper, or if a noble blamed her for a patient's death, she could be hauled before court. Historians still debate whether these prosecutions were about genuine fear of sorcery or about protecting the monopoly of church-approved medicine. Likely it was both. There's a tale of a midwife accused after a noblewoman died in childbirth. Though she had served the village faithfully for years, the court declared her practices unnatural. She was fined, shunned, and eventually driven away. Her knowledge was lost, leaving the community weaker, but the law was satisfied. Even stranger, some treatments were criminalized not for danger, but for competition. Physicians trained under church or university systems charged high fees. Folk healers, offering remedies for pennies, threatened their authority. So the law often branded them as charlatans or worse. Imagine being sued today not because your medicine failed, but because it was too cheap and too effective. Yet the irony was rich. The same church that condemned folk cures also practiced bizarre remedies, powdered gemstones, relics pressed to wounds, or bloodletting until patients fainted. To survive, peasants often turned to whoever gave them hope, even if it meant breaking the law. The woman in the hut finishes her paste and hands it to a coughing child. Her eyes dart once more to the door. You step away quietly, realizing that in this world healing wasn't just kindness, it was rebellion. And sometimes the law punished hope as harshly as sin. The herb woman's hut fades into the night as you follow a road climbing toward a fortress-like gate. Above it, banners whip in the wind, their emblems sharp against the moonlight. Guards pace the walls, spears glinting, their eyes hard. Here the law sharpens to its deadliest edge: treason. In medieval Europe, nothing invited harsher punishment than betraying your ruler. Treason was defined so broadly, it could mean almost anything. Plotting against the king, aiding enemies, forging coins, or even speaking ill of your lord. It wasn't just disloyalty. It was the ultimate crime, an attack on the very order of the realm. And the punishments? Designed not just to kill, but to terrify. You picture a man accused of conspiring with enemies. His trial is swift, the evidence thin. Still, he is condemned to the gruesome fate of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. First hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still alive. His body finally cut into 4 pieces and displayed across the kingdom. The message was clear: betray the crown and your very flesh becomes a warning. Historians still debate whether all accounts of such executions were accurate or exaggerated by chroniclers, but the fear they instilled was real enough. One tale lingers of a blacksmith accused of clipping coins, shaving silver from their edges to sell. Technically, this was treason, since it weakened the king's currency. His punishment? Boiling alive in a cauldron of water and oil, while the crowd watched in horrified silence. The cruelty wasn't random. It was theater, law turned into spectacle. And treason wasn't just about politics. Fail to pay military taxes, harbor an enemy soldier, or even shelter a fugitive, and you could be branded a traitor. The crime swallowed entire families, because wives and children often shared the punishment. Lands confiscated, names disgraced, futures erased. The absurdity comes in small, almost comical details. Records speak of men accused of treason, for grumbling about the king's hunting dogs being too fat, or for failing to cheer loudly enough at royal processions. In today's world, that would be like facing execution for skipping a standing ovation. But here, loyalty wasn't optional. It was enforced at the edge of a blade. You step past the fortress gate, hearing the distant clatter of chains, the creak of gallows in the wind. Treason laws weren't about justice. They were about fear, power, and making sure no one ever forgot who ruled. And in that silence you realize here, survival meant not only obedience but performance. The fortress walls shrink behind you as dawn begins to smear pale light across the horizon. The village is quiet now. Its fires burned low, its people curled in uneasy sleep. Yet in the silence, the sheer weight of all you've witnessed presses heavy. Laws that punished hunger, silenced voices, chained children, even judged animals. The pattern is unmistakable. Justice here was never about fairness. It was about control. You wander past fields still wet with dew, thinking of the peasant who hid a sack of grain and paid with his life, of the woman healer who offered herbs and was branded dangerous, of the boy whipped for stones thrown at a goat. Each story links to the next, a web spun tighter than any spider's, binding not only individuals, but entire communities in fear. Historians still debate whether medieval law was truly as ruthless in daily practice as the records suggest, or if chroniclers, always serving lords or the church, magnified its cruelty. Maybe some peasants slipped through unnoticed, breaking rules quietly in corners where no steward watched. Maybe laughter sometimes drowned out fear. But what's undeniable is the atmosphere the laws created. A constant hum of anxiety where any misstep could be fatal. The absurdity lingers too. Window taxes that made homes darker, clothing rules that criminalized color. Pigs marched to trial as if they understood Latin. Laws that look laughable now, but back then they were dead serious. And perhaps that's the most chilling part. The ridiculous and the terrifying walked hand in hand. You glanced toward the manor, its silhouette stark against the brightening sky. To the lords, these laws justified their power, propped up their wealth and kept rebellion at bay. To the church, they reinforced obedience, binding souls as firmly as bodies. To peasants, they were simply chains. Some visible, some invisible, but all unyielding. The path grows softer under your feet as you realize you've reached the edge of the journey. One more step and the story turns inward. What it meant to live under such laws, what it cost to keep breathing in a world where every act, every word, every silence carried risk, and so you walk slowly. The weight of centuries clinging to your cloak, ready to let the harsh voices of the past fall quiet at last. The sun edges above the horizon now, washing the village in muted gold. Smoke curls gently from chimneys, birds stir in hedgerows, and for a fleeting moment the world feels almost peaceful. Yet beneath that quiet lies the weight of everything you've seen, the endless maze of laws, punishments, and fears that shaped medieval life. And as the light softens the shadows, your own steps begin to slow. You think of the peasants, their backs bent under sacks of grain too heavy to carry, yet demanded by law. You remember the children punished for play, the strangers turned away, the healers silenced, the accused burned for shadows of witchcraft. Each life bound by rules so harsh, they blurred into absurdity. It is almost too much to hold, yet here in the calm of morning, the noise of cruelty fades into a dull hum. Historians still debate the purpose of it all. Were these laws truly enforced every day, or were they hammers raised high meant to frighten more than to fall? Perhaps not every villager met the gallows. Perhaps not every loaf was weighed with suspicion. But the fear, that constant pressure, was real enough to shape lives, to make survival itself an art of caution. And that fear lingers, like an echo across centuries. The air is cooler now, drifting softly against your skin. The torches, the jeers, the cries of punishment, all seem far away, as if dissolving in the distance. What remains is a strange hush, as though the land itself exhales. You let that hush settle inside you, each breath a little slower, each thought a little dimmer. The chains, the courts, the cruel spectacles, one by one they loosen, fading into mist. The stories become softer now, slipping from sharp images into gentle fragments. The shimmer of crimson cloth forbidden by law, the hollow echo of dungeon chains, the faint laugh of a child who dared to play. They drift through your mind like smoke, rising, thinning, disappearing into the pale morning light. And so, as you stand at the edge of this journey, the harshness of medieval law becomes just another memory, distant, muted, powerless. The fear ebbs away, leaving only calm, a steady rhythm of breath and silence. The past lies behind you, heavy no more. Now let your eyelids grow heavier too. The images dim, the voices fade, the story softens into a whisper. All that remains is quiet, and the slow, easy pull of rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.